Hey there BookTube, welcome back to my channel, and we are back for the next section of our read along. We are reading Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and we just finished chapter 1 in our previous video. You might want to go and watch that video first. I'll begin with chapter 2, page 12. When Bailey was 6 and I a year younger, we used to rattle off the times table with the speed I was later to see Chinese children in San Francisco employ on their abacuses. Our summer gray pot-bellied stove bloomed rosy red during winter and became a severe disciplinarian threat if we were so foolish as to indulge in making mistakes. Uncle Willie used to sit like a giant black Z, he had been crippled as a child, and hear us testify to the Lafayette County Training School's abilities. His face pulled down on the left side as if a pulley had been attached to his lower teeth, and his left hand was only a mite bigger than Bailey's. But on the second mistake, or on the third hesitation, his big, overgrown right hand would catch one of us behind the collar, and in the same moment would thrust the culprit toward the dull red heater, which throbbed like a devil's toothache. We were never burned, although once I might have been when I was so terrified I tried to jump onto the stove to remove the possibility of its remaining a threat. Like most children, I thought if I could face the worst danger voluntarily and triumph, I would forever have power over it. But in my case of sacrificial effort, I was thwarted. Uncle Willie held tight to my dress, and I only got close enough to smell the clean, dry scent of hot iron. We learned the times tables without understanding their grand principle, simply because we had the capacity and no alternative. The tragedy of lameness seems so unfair to children that they are embarrassed in its presence, and they, most recently off nature's mold, sense that they have only narrowly missed being another of her jokes. In relief at the narrow escape, they vent their emotions in impatience and criticism of the unlucky cripple. Mama related times without end and without any show of emotion how Uncle Willie had been dropped when he was 3 years old by a woman who was minding him. She seemed to hold no rancor against the babysitter. Not for her, just God who allowed the accident. She felt it necessary to explain over and over again to those who knew the story by heart that he wasn't born that way. In our society, where two-legged, two-armed, strong black men were able to, at best, to eke out only the necessities of life, Uncle Willie, with his starched shirts, shine shoes, and shelves full of food, was the whipping boy and butt of jokes of the underemployed and underpaid. Fate not only disabled him, but laid a double-tiered barrier in his path. He was also proud and sensitive. Therefore, he couldn't pretend that he wasn't crippled, nor could he deceive himself that people were not repelled by his defect. Only once in all the years of trying not to watch him, I saw him pretend to himself and others that he wasn't lame. Coming home from school one day, I saw a dark car in our front yard. I rushed in to find a strange man and woman. Uncle Willie said later they were school teachers from Little Rock, drinking Dr. Pepper in the cool of the store. I sensed a wrongness around me like an alarm clock that had gone off without being set. I knew it couldn't be strangers. Not frequently, but often enough, travelers pulled off the main road to buy tobacco or soft drinks in the only Negro store in Stamps. When I looked at Uncle Willie, I knew what was pulling my mind's coattails. He was standing erect behind the counter, not leaning forward or resting on the small shelf that had been built for him. Erect. His eyes seemed to hold me with a mixture of threats and appeal. I dutifully greeted the strangers and roamed my eyes around for his walking stick. It was nowhere to be seen. He said, my niece, she just come from school. Then to the couple, you know how children are these days. They play all the day at school and can't wait to get home and play some more. The people smiled, very friendly. He added, "Go on out and play, sister." The lady laughed in a soft Arkansas voice and said, "Well, you know, Mr. Johnson, they say you're only a child once. Have you children of your own?" Uncle Willie looked at me with an impatience I hadn't seen in his face even when he took 30 minutes to loop the laces over his high-topped shoes. I thought I told you to go outside and play." Before I left, I saw him lean back on the shelves of Garrett Snuff, Prince Albert, and Spark Plug chewing tobacco. No, ma'am, no children and no wife. He tried a laugh. I have an old mother and my brother's 2 children to look after. I didn't mind his using us to make himself look good. In fact, I would have pretended to be his daughter if he wanted me to. Not only did I not feel any loyalty to my own father, I figured that if I had been Uncle Willie's child, I would have received much better treatment. The couple left after a few minutes, and from the back of the house, I watched a red car scare chickens, raise dust, and disappear toward Magnolia. Uncle Willie was making his way down the long shadowed aisle between the shelves and the counter, hand over hand, like a man climbing out of a dream. I stayed quiet and watched him lurch from one side, bumping to the other, until he reached a coal oil tank. He put his hand behind that dark recess and took his cane in the strong fist and shifted his weight on the wooden support. He thought he had pulled it off. I'll never know why it was important to him that the couple, he said later that he'd never seen them before, would take a picture of a whole Mr. Johnson back to Little Rock. He must have tired of being crippled, as prisoners tire of penitentiary bars and the guilty tire of blame. The high-top shoes and the cane, his uncontrollable muscles and thick tongue, and the looks he suffered of either contempt or pity had simply worn him out. And for one part of an afternoon, he wanted no part of them. I understood and felt closer to him at that moment than ever before or since. During these years in stamps, I met and fell in love with William Shakespeare. He was my first white love. Although I enjoyed and respected Kipling, Poe, Butler, Thackeray, and Henley, I saved my young and loyal passion for Paul Laurence Dunbar, Langston Hughes, James Weldon Johnson, and W.E.B. Du Bois. Litany at Atlanta. But it was Shakespeare who said, "When in disgrace with fortune in men's eyes." It was a state with which I felt myself most familiar. I pacified myself about his whiteness by saying that after all, he had been dead so long it couldn't matter to anyone anymore. Bailey and I decided to memorize a scene from The Merchant of Venice, but we realized that Mama would question us about the author and that we'd have to tell her that Shakespeare was white, and it wouldn't matter to her whether he was dead or not. So we chose The Creation by James Weldon Johnson instead. And that's the end of chapter 2. Now for chapter 3. Weighing the half-pounds of flour, excluding the scoop, and depositing them dust-free into the thin paper sacks held a simple kind of adventure for me. I developed an eye for measuring how full a silver-looking ladle of flour, mash, meal, sugar, or corn had to be to push the scale indicator over to 8 ounces or 1 pound. When I was absolutely accurate, our appreciative customers used to admire, "Sister Henderson sure got some smart grandchildrens." If I was off in the store's favor, the eagle-eyed woman would say, "Put somewhere in that sack, child. Don't you try to make your profit off of me." Then I would quietly but persistently punish myself. For every bad judgment, the fine was no silver-wrapped kisses, the sweet chocolate drops that I loved more than anything in the world except Bailey, and maybe canned pineapples. My obsession with pineapples nearly drove me mad. I dreamt of the days when I would be grown and able to buy a whole carton for myself alone. Although the syrupy golden rings sat in their exotic cans on our shelves year-round, we only tasted them during Christmas. Mama used the juice to make almost black fruit cakes. Then she lined heavy, soot-encrusted iron skillets with the pineapple rings for rich upside-down cakes. Bailey and I received 1 slice each, and I carried mine around for hours, shredding off the fruit until nothing was left except the perfume on my fingers. I'd like to think that my desire for pineapples was so sacred that I wouldn't allow myself to steal a can, which was possible, and eat it alone out in the garden. But I'm certain that I must have weighed the possibility of the scent exposing me and didn't have the nerve to attempt it. Until I was 13 and left Arkansas for good, the store was my favorite place to be. Alone and empty in the mornings, it looked like an unopened present from a stranger. Opening the front doors was pulling the ribbon off the unexpected gift. The light would come in softly. We faced north, easing itself over the shelves of mackerel, salmon, tobacco, thread. It fell flat on the big vat of lard, and by noontime during the summer, the grease had softened to a thick soup. Whenever I walked into the store in the afternoon, I sensed that it was tired. I alone could hear the slow pulse of its job half done. But just before bedtime, after numerous people had walked in and out, had argued over their bills, or joked about their neighbors, or just dropped in to give Sister Henderson a "Hi, y'all," The promise of magic mornings returned to the store and spread itself over the family in washed life waves. Mama opened boxes of crispy crackers and we sat around the meat block at the rear of the store. I sliced onions and Bailey opened 2 or even 3 cans of sardine and allowed their juice of oil and fishing boats to ooze down and around the sides. That was supper. In the evening, when we were alone like that, Uncle Willie didn't stutter or shake or give any indication that he had an affliction. It seemed that the peace of a day's ending was an assurance that the covenant God made with children, Negroes, and the crippled was still in effect. Throwing scoops of corn to the chickens and mixing sour dry mash with leftover food and oily dishwater for the hogs were among our evening chores. Bailey and I sloshed down twilight trails of the pig pens, and standing on the first fence rungs, we poured down the unappealing concoctions to our grateful hogs. They mashed their tender pink snouts down to the slop and rooted and grunted their satisfaction. We always grunted a reply, only half in jest. We were also grateful that we had concluded the dirtiest of chores and had only gotten the evil-smelling swill on our shoes, stockings, feet, and hands. Late one day as we were attending to the pigs, I heard a horse in the front yard. It really should have been called a driveway, except that there was nothing to drive into it, and ran to find out who had come riding up on a Thursday evening when even Mr. Stewart, the quiet, bitter man who owned a riding horse, would be resting by his warm fire until the morning called him out to turn over his field. The used-to-be sheriff sat rakishly astraddle his horse. His nonchalance was meant to convey his authority and power over even dumb animals. How much more capable he would be with Negroes, it went without saying. His twang jogged in the brittle air. From the side of the store, Bailey and I heard him say to Mama, "Annie, tell Willie he better lay low tonight. A crazy nigger messed with a white lady today. Some of the boys will be coming over here later." Even after the slow drag of years, I remember the sense of fear which filled my mouth with hot, dry air and made my body light. The boys? Those cement faces and eyes of hate that burn the clothes off if they happen to see you lounging on the main street downtown on Saturday? Boys? It seemed that youth had never happened to them. Boys? No, rather men who were covered with grave's dust and age without beauty or learning. The ugliness and rottenness of old abominations. If on Judgment Day I were summoned by St. Peter to give testimony to the used-to-be sheriff's act of kindness, I would be unable to say anything on his behalf. His confidence that my uncle and every other black man who heard of the Klan's coming ride would scurry under their houses to hide in chicken droppings was too humiliating to hear. Without waiting for Mama's thanks, he rode out of the yard, sure that things were as they should be, and that he was a gentle squire, saving those deserving serfs from the laws of the land which he condoned. Immediately, while his horse's hoofs were still loudly thudding the ground, Mama blew out the coal oil lamps. She had a quiet, hard talk with Uncle Willie and called Bailey and me into the store. We were told to take the potatoes and onions out of their bins and knock up the dividing walls that kept them apart. Then, with a tedious and fearful slowness, Uncle Willie gave me his rubber-tipped cane and bent down to get into the now enlarged empty bin. It took forever before he lay down flat, and then we covered him with potatoes and onions, layer upon layer like a casserole. Grandmother knelt praying in the darkened store. It was fortunate that the boys didn't ride into our yard that evening and insist that Mama open the store. They would have surely found Uncle Willie and just as surely lynched him. He moaned the whole night through as if he had, in fact, been guilty of some heinous crime. The heavy sounds pushed their way up out of the blanket of vegetables, and I pictured his mouth pulling down on the right side and his saliva flowing into the eyes of new potatoes and waiting there like dewdrops for the warmth of morning. This is very difficult for me to read. But that is the conclusion of chapter 3. In my next video, we'll pick up at chapter 4. I hope you'll come back for that. See you then.